I want to give you a gentle reminder that you may call in on your telephone at the toll-free number listed on your screen. That's 1-844-636-4290. We prefer that you use a landline, but I've used a cell phone in the past, and that works as well for me. To ask you at this time to let everybody know who you are, what district you're here with, and folks that might be sitting in the room with you. So if you don't mind, please include your name, your district, and name of anyone else who's listening at the same time as you are.
We also have a few folks who are from out of state, so if you are out of state, please let us know in chat what state you're from as well.
Yes, welcome. Can you see up on your screen that we are the SPP-TAP program? That's the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project. We work out of Napa County Office of Education on behalf of the California Department of Education. So you can find us at SPPTAP.org, but we'll let you know that as time progresses. I'd like to spend just a couple minutes letting you know what we do here at SPP-TAP. As you're here today, you know that we hold free webinars throughout the year. Our webinars are open to anyone who is interested, and we often have exceptional speakers like the one we have today in Dr. Gregory. We have community of practice meetings. Those are also virtual meetings, and for those meetings, we invite districts who've already been identified as having significant disproportionality. Those districts spend a little time, again, during the lunch hour, talking about what has worked for them in terms of reducing significant disproportionality, what challenges they've run into, and ideas for things to try in the future. Although we record our webinars and share that information with folks, we keep our communities of practice private so that districts can feel able to share whatever they're comfortable with, and we feel like they can do that a little better knowing that what they say is not being recorded or shared again in the future. So again, our website is SPPTAP.org. There's a lot of wonderful information on disproportionality and significant disproportionality and intervention processes. I encourage you to spend a little time at our website, and especially when you go to the first screen, click on significant disproportionality and take a look at our four-phase process. I think you'll be impressed. We have ongoing assistance. You see the little pink brain and the little green brain. We are willing to help with any of your questions or concerns or processes in working toward the reduction of significant disproportionality, and we do that through assistance directly to school districts. When you go to the website, you'll see my name, Connie's name. Connie is our director, and you'll see our email addresses, and I even have my cell phone posted there. So we're very available to help. And as I mentioned, Connie Silva Broussard and Sharon Forkfalls, those are our email addresses below. So we try to make our webinars interactive, and so we want you to feel like you can participate throughout this session. You can write in the chat box. We will put down a whiteboard. We may do a poll or a question and answer, and we want you to feel free to express your questions, concerns, ideas at any time. So again, we're recording this and we will share it with anyone who's interested soon after we're complete. And this is the fun part. I get to introduce our topic and our speaker. So our topic today is Shifting Mindsets and Relationships for Equity. And I get to introduce to you our esteemed professor, Associate Professor of the Department of Psychology at Rutgers University, Dr. Ann Gregory. Dr. Ann works on the continuing challenge of suspensions and expulsions for African American children and youth in our American public schools. So in an effort to increase equity and address this area of need, Dr. Gregory addresses and studies and teaches in the areas of teacher-student relationships, professional development, culturally responsive, and reflective practices. So I ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Ann Gregory to today's webinar.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I'm hoping that the sound is okay. Folks can hear me. Just type in if there's problems with the audio. So before I get started, I wanted to actually just spend a moment recognizing Susan Stewart and Sharon Falk for their courage getting this webinar together and their persistence during the fires that have been going on in the Petaluma and Napa areas. So thank you so much, and our thoughts are with you. So for everyone else on the webinar, welcome. I hope you're grabbing a bite to eat out west. And I'm looking forward to spending some time with you this afternoon. Again, this will be somewhat interactive, so I will be asking if you can step up to your computers every now and then and do some reflection. Let's see. All right, so let me go ahead and just get started here. So to increase equitable schooling, many districts, I'm sure, including your own, have brought in a range of what we might think of as technical reforms, and that might include the alphabet soup of interventions. We've got FEL, RJ or RP, PBIS, and in fact, for many of you, this triangle looks awfully familiar. Multi-tiered systems of support, and some schools are offering things at Tier 1, programming such as responsive classroom. Maybe they're doing some social skill groups at Tier 2 to address behavioral issues, maybe check-in and check-out, a mentoring program, and then at Tier 3, maybe there's a referral out to community-based organizations for more intensive interventions. Many school districts are implementing restorative practices or restorative justice programming. Perhaps at Tier 1, for example, they're doing community building circles or proactive circles. Tier 2, they might have reactive circles or reducing harm for low-level harm. And then at Tier 3, perhaps they have restorative conferences for more serious harm or reentry circles. So schools can make, as we know, generous lists of programs. Sometimes it's a patchwork of programs. But I wanted to actually back up today in this webinar with you and think about really the foundation or the building blocks of all of the programming, because we all know that at the core, the way adults interact during programs matter. We all intuitively know this. But how much attention do we really play in a very systematic, mindful way to the importance of the quality of relationships throughout all of our programming, our equity-oriented reforms? And this really came up for me when interviewing some high school students who had gone through restorative conferences. Now, most students in the interview said very positive things about their experience of expressing student voice, their experience of being heard, and problem solving during restorative conferences. However, some students had some negative things to say about their experience. So I want to provide you some student voice here. Here's what one student said. She's speaking during her experience of restorative conferences. So it made me want to snap. So again, think this is during a restorative conference, so it didn't go well for her. Here's another student. Take a minute to read the quote. This student is basically saying, you know, how do you expect me to participate when you're yelling at me, and so you just need to chill out, he said. And so clearly during these two conferences, the spirit of restorative practice and restorative justice is missing, not a well-implemented conference for sure. And in fact, Adults can also notice when new programming comes in that the spirit of restorative practices might be there, or the other programming they're bringing in. So for instance, I was in a large urban district recently, and a school psychologist said, you know, our district is supposed to be bringing in restorative practices, but when I go into disciplinary meetings, it's really the same old shaming and blaming.
Like
structures, we might bring in strategies, we might bring in knowledge, meaning that we think about programming, we think about professional development, but often we don't talk about other kinds of change that is necessary for successful technical change. And they bring up this issue of how political change is often not discussed. So we don't talk about how power may need to be redistributed or actually enacted differently in our schools to have successful programming. Think about your reform efforts right now. Have interactions among those who hold decision-making authority been altered or changed? So here we see predominantly white, as it appears at least, in the folks speaking. So we need to think about who's comprising positions of power in our school. But we also should think about these types of questions. What has or has not changed in terms of who's at the table, who participates in resolving conflict, whose voices are being lifted up. These are some kind of tough questions to ask. We may bring in programs, this idea of changing the way we're doing things in terms of equity, but if we don't question how kind of power operates in our school, we may not really be getting at some important issues. Jeannie Oakes and her colleagues also bring up the idea that norms are often not discussed. I think this is a really big take-home point to consider throughout the webinar today. Norms are schools' cultural regularities, ways of being. So these are things we barely notice. It's just how things are done this way in our school. And what I want to question throughout today is, as we bring in new programs, do we really have the same old norms? Without changing norms, and this is a quote from the article, new techniques will inspire only reluctant compliance, and we will simply be forced into traditional conceptions of schooling. Coerced changes may only give a new guide to old practices. I'm sure this should ring a bell for many folks who have initiative fatigue. As many programs are brought in, there can be a kind of active resistance and an undermining of the new programming. And perhaps it's because we haven't surfaced what those norms are. So again, in this article, they talk about how instead of the currently prevailing norms of individualism, fragmentation, and hierarchical authority, we might consider other norms that would be more focused towards equity, norms of communitarianism, integration, and a democratic distribution of authority. These norms might actually resonate in your equity-oriented reforms when you're addressing disproportionality or discipline gaps. The challenging reflection question is, what are your new norms? What are the everyday practices you're trying to instill? What are your old and persistent norms that might actually be undermining your reforms? So in all today, I'm really hoping to raise consciousness about normative and political changes that are supporting or undermining your technical changes. So this is a challenge, frankly, because we know it's hard enough to bring in kind of big technical challenges. But we need to kind of dig a bit deeper to think more about how our programming might be undermined or supported, for that matter. What I'm going to do is a table of contents for the webinar today. We're going to talk about district codes of conduct and some reflection on your own codes of conduct. We're going to talk about this notion of teacher mindsets or educator mindsets. We're also going to talk about ways of being with students, this idea of everyday interaction and how they reflect our norms in terms of our beliefs about the purposes of discipline and education, for that matter. And then finally, I'm going to circle back to maybe a more technical reform and offer some professional development programming that is available for free for folks if they're interested and it relates to these topics. So before I proceed, though, I want to stop and see if there's any comments or thoughts in the last few minutes from what I've just said. I don't know if Sharon, if there was any thoughts It looks like we have the technical issues have been resolved around the audio.
And, I just wanted to let you know that for some reason we're having audio issues on our end, so we can't respond to you. So
Okay.
we'll figure out a way to let you know if we have any comments that we want to share with you.
Okay. So we will just get going. I want to just make sure folks can hear me okay. All right. Let's talk about codes of conduct. So it's not the most exciting topic, I have to admit, but I've read many, many codes of conduct, and I want to share one particular city's code of conduct, partly because they spent a lot of community building time and consensus building around the revised code of conduct in the Syracuse city. So they were addressing issues of disproportionality, and they did a complete overhaul of their district code of conduct. And I want to actually share with you, it's a little bit of a long quote, but I think it's worth sharing. This is in the introduction to their code. So what I want to highlight here is some norms that I think are really arise out of this opening statement. The code here, I'm going to read this. The code ensures that schools provide equal access to a wide range of supports and interventions that promote positive behavior, help students develop self-discipline and social and emotional efficacy, and enable students to improve and correct. So you'll see that I highlighted those words in red on purpose because I think they're speaking to some implicit norms they're trying to set in their school. I think it's norms related to equity, equitable access, to support and addressing students' developmental needs, seeing discipline as an enterprise in social and emotional learning, and then finally a problem-solving attitude towards discipline. So you see where it says enabling students to improve. So in your own school policies, some of you may know them more closely than others. What are the implicit norms that kind of are weaved throughout that document? Are they focused inherently on issues of equity? Is there an SEL focus, problem-solving focus? Is that just the kind of everyday ways of doing things in your school, if that's what's presented in your code? In my experience in many schools recently that are trying to bring in new programming, there's been a fundamental block often because there's this belief in the need for punishment. I work with school districts around trying to move away from a punitive approach to discipline. At the core, there can be a deep-seated belief that discipline is needed to hold students accountable. I think it's important to ferret out if that's a norm in your school, a deep-seated belief, an everyday practice that punishment is central to accountability, or other alternate narratives around how students can be held accountable and learn and grow through discipline or conflict, and move away from this punitive mentality. Many schools, as I'm noting, there's a focus on this notion of reparation, of harm, and social and emotional learning. And in fact, I wanted to share some research that I conducted with data and colleagues through the Denver Public Schools. What we found is that there are tier 2 or tier 3 interventions for restorative conferencing and intervention. Students in the fall who participated in restorative conferences had a lower chance than other students who had been sent into the discipline system. They had a lower chance of future disciplinary referrals and a lower chance of out-of-school suspension. This relationship held when we accounted for the severity of the reason they were disciplined, the number of prior discipline referrals, and also students' race and socioeconomic status, English, whether they were an English language learner or in special education. But so this is, I think, really promising. So we've got some kind of newer research here showing the positive effects. But honestly, in a lot of schools that I'm studying around implementation, it's much more patchy in terms of implementing at the tier 1 level. And so I would ask in your own districts, if you are implementing restorative practices or kind of problem-solving approaches, how often is it sewn into the fabric of your staff where they're using kind of restorative questions like these, where all staff throughout the day and even the students start to internalize these types of focus on repairing harm or making things right as these questions ask. I think that's a tremendous challenge for districts, is trying to kind of move towards a problem-solving approach in their disciplinary processes and away from this fundamental core belief in the need for punishment. That's what I would want to just stop for a second and ask you all to reflect. And I know this is hard because people are probably multitasking, but turn now to your computer if you might. And I would ask, to what degree do your norms lay the foundation for repairing harm and social-emotional learning when conflict occurs? So to what degree in your schools is this just what we do? Everyday practice is towards SEL and repairing harm as fundamentally part of our disciplinary process and ways of being when conflict arises, low-level conflict like that. Take a moment. I'm going to be quiet and give you about 5 minutes to do some typing. Thank you. Okay, so thank you so much for these rich comments. It's a pleasure to read them, and thank you for engaging. I know that we're asking you to do a little work here and do some sharing, but I think it's important to create that community of practice in terms of sharing the highs and lows of the addressing the, as one person put it, the water we swim in. And we see in these comments, if I'm hoping you get a chance to read your colleagues across the state, some real patchy shifts, right? We have some folks talking about like, well, it's just on posters. Other folks are saying that, you know, it's infused in everything we do. There's this notion of work in progress. There's also a theme that there isn't a lot of discussion about our norms. And so of really trying to increase that kind of deep belief and buy-in from the staff as a whole. So it sounds like sometimes there's certain schools within the district that have really taken SEL or problem-solving approach, but maybe not all the schools. But I do think this is kind of an important piece for us to kind of surface in the field and in doing the everyday work, is what are our deep beliefs around punishment. A teacher said to me the other day, we need to ask every semester to our faculty, what is the purpose of discipline? We need to always surface this discussion and talk to each other about our deep beliefs in how learning occurs around behavior and how conflict is resolved and how it relates to culture and how it relates to, one person brought up this issue of the cultural capital of the students, what the students are bringing in, what the staff are bringing in. So I think this is really important. Okay, so thank you so much for engaging in this question. We're going to move on. There's more questions ahead, so stay with it. All right, great. Now shifting gears a little bit to this notion of teacher mindset. So, you know, I was a little hesitant to use the word mindset because, you know, that's kind of thrown around all the time. But it's really just circling back to these kinds of norms, of ways of being. And I actually wanted to start with describing one evocative study. Now, the point of going into some detail about this study is to say that we can shift in terms of our mindset. So let's see, here we go. Looks like a picture of me came up, but that's okay. We'll work with that. So let me go ahead and explain this study to you. So this was a randomized experiment. So teachers, math teachers, in fact, were randomly assigned to either an empathic mindset condition or a control condition. The aim of the empathic mindset condition was to increase teachers' perspective taking about student misconduct and promote a context of trust and understanding. The aim, so more concretely, it was to teach teachers about how there are many different reasons why students behave in certain ways. And why they may have dysregulated behavior. So all the multiple contributing factors to student behavior. It's not just that the student maybe has a vendetta against the teacher. It's much more complicated, as we all know. So they read an article about contributors to student behavior, but they also read testimonials from students about how they personally were impacted by the positive student-teacher relationship. So the importance of relationships for them in the classroom and how that impacted their behavior. Teachers also were asked to write about their practice in terms of how they used relationships and positive relationships in their classroom to elicit cooperation. And they were told, your writings will be part of professional development for new teachers. So they were seen as experts. I think that's important to think about when teachers' practice and knowledge gets honored. So half the teachers were given this intervention, half given control. And let me share with you the findings. So students in the classroom of teachers in the empathic mindset interventions were half as likely to receive a suspension relative to their peers in the control teachers' classrooms that school year. So, did you catch that? That's pretty powerful, right? That students, there was basically a 50% reduction. They kind of in the intervention, students with the intervention teachers had 50% fewer suspensions. Now, given racial and gender disparities in school discipline, there was also striking findings related to gender and for Latino and African American students. So we see here that boys in the empathic mindset, who were taught by teachers in the empathic mindset condition, had lower suspension rates, and the same also for African American and Latino students relative to those students taught by the control teachers. I think this is just one study, but it does give us some hints that mindset can shift. It also has introduced an important concept to us, this notion of empathy or an empathic mindset. From my perspective, an empathic mindset is one in which your staff and you not just develop a greater understanding about the range of reasons students struggle, so not just develop it, but hold on to it when there's stress and fatigue in your school day. Now that can be really hard to do. There's some evidence that racial disparities in discipline referrals increase towards the end of the day. And the hypothesis is that people are worn down, that implicit racial bias can kind of rear its head when educators are worn down later in the day. So I would just flip that and say, how do we kind of nurture empathic mindsets, hold on to them during the stresses and strains of the intense workday that so many of you experience on a regular basis? So that's another kind of moment of reflection for you to write in. How do you nurture an empathic mindset in your school? I'm going to be quiet. Okay. So let's look at a little bit at some of these comments. We see that students are kind of, wow, Sarah mentioned, I've heard teachers say he's just lazy, stubborn, but other folks are kind of, so that's some kind of negative practices that they're kind of talking about, attributing maybe this kind of very narrow perception of what's contributing to that student's behavior. But there's also someone who's mentioning providing experiential experience, which allows staff to feel what it would be like to be in the shoes of students of color. And I think that's pretty powerful. And actually later I'll be presenting some professional development where we try to integrate that in. The use of reflective practice in meetings, so I think that that's important to think about, is spending some time doing reflection on these types of issues with your staff, learning about students and families' experience, cultural heritage, socio-political context, struggle. So all of that is this idea of, I think, creating kind of a consciousness coupled with an empathic perspective taking. So thank you for sharing all those ideas. Okay, so we'll go back to the slides now. Thank you. All right, so moving along, I want to now switch to speaking about relationships, ways of being with students. First of all, just to bring in some research here, we know from meta-analyses that student positive relationships with adults in school are strongly linked to their positive educational outcomes. So I cannot overstate how having supportive relationships with adults in school are predictive of things like graduation and achievement and discipline and academic performance. So I think we intuitively know how important the relational qualities of school are. I just don't think we often focus enough on that, frankly. We think in our everyday work, it's very intuitive to all of us how important relationships are. But there's also particularly concern for some students more than others in terms of the relational quality. So for students of color, and especially African American males, we know from preschool suspension rates that the gaps in suspension rates start early as pre-K. So this was recently released once again, another year of data showing this from 2013-2014 that the Feds released. So the fear, of course, is a snowball metaphor, the idea that for some students, particularly boys of color, this kind of snowball effect can happen and culminate in middle school and high school, where then a relationship gap exists. And so I wanted to actually share with you about 4 studies that show evidence that in some schools, by middle and high school, there is, in fact, a racial relationship gap. So this study was conducted in schools in California, in middle schools, and Hispanic and Black students were less likely than students from other racial groups to report feeling really cared about by an adult in the school. So that's obviously very concerning if we don't have a kind of a climate of belonging and connecting for all students. In Maryland, another study showed that Black students in high school reported less care and respect from their teachers relative to white students. Again, this is of great concern for all of us in terms of thinking about racial equities in school, that not only do we see kind of achievement gaps and discipline gaps, but we see this kind of relational gap that can happen for students. And students aren't alone in detecting this. Another study by Hughes showed that elementary teachers following students over time reported less warmth in the relationship with Black students compared with white students. So they're also reporting less connection or less warmth with Black students. Again, very concerning as well. So we see like this perception is happening both from the student and the adult perspective. Another study showed that discipline gaps were greater in schools in which students reported less connection to school adults. So in other words, there was greater disparities between Black and white students in terms of suspension in schools where there was just generally less connection to adults. So this is further emphasizing how seriously we need to take the relational quality of schooling, the norms around every days of being with one another, the ways that we create community. So there's been a lot of focus on this notion of school climate. So what is a positive school climate? What is it comprised of? And I myself have done a fair amount of research related to this idea of authoritative relationships. So when we think about what comprises an authoritative school climate or authoritative relationships, there's 2 concepts that I have really been examining closely. The idea that students need a sense of support. A student might say, yes, adults in this school really care about all the students, but they also need high academic press, high fairness or structure. So I look at this idea of high support and high structure, and some of my colleagues at University of Virginia have done a lot of work in this area of authoritative discipline climate. So that teachers also don't just make it easy work, but make me think. They have a fairness and a consistency in the way they apply the rules. When we think about this kind of quality of relationships, I would just ask us through this webinar to keep pushing on this question, what makes good relationships in schools? What are the dimensions of good relationships? Now, I just brought in 2, high structure, high support. But in your own practice, to be pushing yourself to think, how can we grow the dimensions of positive relationships in our school? So here, teachers know, obviously intuitively, how important relationships are. Here's some quotes from teachers I want to share with you about what they think are part of positive relationships. I'm skipping a little bit. Let me back up for a second. Authoritative relationships in schools. I have shown in some research that schools with more of a higher authoritative relationships have lower suspension rates, and in fact, they also have more narrow black and white suspension gaps as well than other schools. Some research there to share. Okay, so let me get to the teacher quotes here. So take a moment to read this teacher quote. He says, I'm going to let you read it. I'll start you off. I have a hard time thinking so specifically in terms of classroom management. That's kind of seeing them as human beings. So again, we all nod our heads and think, yes, this is it. This experience of being seen as an individual, individuating. So I would just say in everyday practice throughout school, how do students experience being seen, having this sense of identity safety when there are multiple aspects of who they are in terms of race and culture, neighborhood, country of origin, ability status? How can they bring that into the building and be seen for who they are? What's happening in your schools on a regular basis to actually see kids as individuals? There's another teacher who talks about the notion of showing care, and I've already emphasized this, but I think it can't be emphasized enough. He said about a student who was, she was saying about a student who is struggling with other teachers, if he feels like a teacher cares about him and wants the best for him, then he's going to respond to them, show care. Again, this is one of those things we all know, but it can't be emphasized enough. There's a teacher who talks about the importance of recognizing students' lives outside of academic content. Take a minute to read that. Striking about this particular quote was that the student also recognized how special their relationship was between the student and the science teacher. The science teacher went out of its way to really connect with this student around non-content, non-academic content, and it made a tremendous difference because the student was struggling and was perceived as defiant from many, many other teachers. It really, again, this brings me to the point of how folks, this is another reflection question, moving in here for a second. I have a couple to add to the mix here, so get your typing fingers ready. So how are you systematically fostering positive adult-student relationships in your school? So this is really to share with your colleagues your strategies for doing that. And not only that, how do you reach diverse student groups? Are you doing things like going through rosters of students and staff meetings, making sure every single student is connected to an adult? Are you doing kind of community morning meetings or community building circles? What are you doing to foster that sense of connection with adults? And then to grow the practice of positive relationships, I would ask you to think critically about when you observe a teacher, what do you see that indicates the teacher has good relationships with students? It's this idea that for us to really grow positive relationships, we also have to figure out what are the behaviors that we can point out and try to reinforce and grow within our staff or within the school staff. I'll give you a minute to type, a couple minutes. Thanks. Thank you so much. I think the most evocative question was people writing in about what behavioral indicators they see when they're looking for the quality of relationships. And so just to kind of summarize, this idea of being relaxed and playful, this idea of being attending to students carefully and being engaged, proximity, all the good classroom management stuff circulating, but also being careful about where the students of color are seated, their use of choice of words, whether the teacher really listens to students, smiles even, facial expressions, being warm. So I think all of these are really, really crucial to point out and to celebrate in your teachers and your staff with high quality relationships. And the idea of kind of doing that is to kind of spread ways of being with students and to point out how powerful these types of body language, their commuting expectations to students, so that students are amazing detectors of all these kind of subtle ways we can communicate with how much we care about them. So why don't I go back to the PowerPoint, and I'm going to really, all your comments are a great segue into the next portion of the webinar. So what I'm going to be talking about next is a professional development opportunity to strengthen relationships. I don't want us to get away from thinking about norms and thinking about ways of being and kind of get into the technical side of implementing a new program. But I think the reason I'm bringing this particular program forward is I think it taps into a lot of the idea of kind of relationship building, empathic mindset, many of the concepts I've already talked about. The program also is free, and it can be, thanks to some grant funding, it can be accessed online. And so you'll have, I know Susan will pop up the link for folks if they're interested. And I will go into some of the content of the core, but really I want to just orient you to it to see if you have any further interest in it, to delve into it. So Susan has gone ahead and put the website up on the chat box. So let me tell you a little bit about this. This is designed for grades K to 8. However, I would say that I know there's concepts in there that high school teachers could draw from. It does take 6 to 8 hours to complete. It's one-on-one. It's an interactive, kind of computer-based, interactive professional development opportunity. But districts have been doing certain modules of the district and then integrating PLC work around it. And what we've done with colleagues at the University of Virginia is really try to break down component parts of how to develop very positive relationships and in classrooms and throughout the school. So we talk about this notion of being aware of your beliefs and how beliefs can impact your actions. We talk about learning to observe more objectively, especially for students. And in the case of my own work, I'm particularly interested in trying to help students get out of that disciplinary rut. So and my focus has been on students of color and trying to move away from just looking at a student from a single negative lens. And then finally, in the last set of modules, we talk about how to develop classroom activities and lessons that are very engaging and motivating to help build those relationships. So I've kind of gone through each of the circles in this figure. I'm going to walk you through a few of the modules here. So first of all, as I said, it's an online intervention. We have had positive response from teachers. A lot of folks have talked about how they liked the one-on-one administration, gave them some time to do some hard reflection about their practice, but they also liked going back and talking with their colleagues about concepts. So you just develop a login and you go from there. The first module really focuses on what we know about relationships and the power of relationships. We also talk about things like racial discipline gaps and orient the learner to the modules. Then we go into building relationships through an awareness. So this is where we talk about beliefs. And a lot of folks have been talking about things like implicit bias or implicit racial bias in particular. And this is the place where we really try to do some hard reflection with the educators in this module. Module 3 focuses on promoting safety and happiness in the classroom, this idea of kind of having identity-safe classrooms where you can kind of bring your whole self into the room. We also focus on the notion of how important it is that students have a sense of capability and feel valued. And then we must, as always, talk about how engaging and motivating instructional activities and techniques are key to helping kids develop those positive relationships. And so there were a few comments back a few minutes ago related to how important engagement is. So we do go through some very, very concrete strategies to increase engagement in the room. I actually wanted to really delve a little more into Module 2. I think this relates the most to what I've been talking about today. I'm going to show you some material from that module and think through kind of issues of racial equity and discipline gaps, so it can relate, obviously, to your equity work. So in Module 2, we focus on raising teacher awareness about how perceptions of others influence how we act or behave towards others. We try to help bring beliefs within awareness. So we know that we can actually increase our awareness of unconscious beliefs, and so that's the frame we work from here. We use a lot of teacher testimonials to also talk about how they themselves have had experienced harm. They have recognized their own harmful beliefs also within their staff around varying dimensions. So we focus on things like how a student or parent presents themselves in terms of clothing, in terms of the kind of neighborhood history or perceived gang affiliation, and how that can then impact the opportunities educators give students or restrict for that matter. We also ask teachers to take a moment to really explicate maybe some of the negative stereotypes that might be affecting students at the school. And here's a sample response from one educator who said, "At my school, we have a lot of recent immigrants. I'm concerned that people make assumptions about students who are struggling with English as a second language. They assume they're not very smart, but in reality, the students are simply learning a new language and they have outstanding capacities for high-level thinking." So these are some of the kind of important reflective practices that we then try to bring forward, and then the teachers go back and even kind of try out if they had perceptions of, let's say, a kid where they were stuck in a rut with a kid around a discipline incident, they might go back and try to observe them differently and see some positive strengths in them and try to move away from deficit thinking that they might be holding about that student. We also talk about this notion of creating opportunities for students to be sharing and being seen. So this also came up in a lot of your comments. The idea of making these kinds of opportunities, such as during morning meetings or community building circles. Are there times, even through academic assignments, where students get to journal about themselves or show artwork or other aspects of who they are to create identity-safe classrooms? Modules, we also discuss the need for autonomy and leadership for students to develop relationships. We'll speak a little bit more about that, and the notion of attending to the positive. When we think specifically about leadership and agencies in your class, a lot of teachers will say, this is central to what I do. You know, I really create opportunities for leadership and agency. I deeply believe it. There's research to show when you go to observe classrooms, that's really not the case. There are not very actual, authentic leadership opportunities where students are really getting to kind of take the lead and express student voice in a meaningful way. And in fact, in some of the coaching programs I've worked with, there's been a lot of fear and trepidation about what it would mean to let students to get up and move in the room. Will I lose control? What happens if letting them come to the front of the room? So I think there can be a lot of fear about harnessing students' agency, but we know that if students have a sense of relevancy and connection, meaningfulness, where they feel a sense of ownership in the room, you know, we can elicit cooperation, develop strong relationships, diffuse conflict when it occurs. Okay, so with that said, I've also had a lot of educators say, you know what, harnessing students' autonomy and leadership is also key in my disciplinary approach. And when those students who exhibit more kind of negative leadership with their peers, I try to turn that around. I try to use it and have them learn more pro-social leadership skills. And so I'm just curious to hear from you all. How have you harnessed leadership qualities of students who have multiple referrals? What kind of creative leadership opportunities have you engaged students in, especially the ones who have multiple discipline referrals? I'm going to give you some time to type. Thank you. Right. Thank you for typing in. A couple of things I want to note. That I think Sarah mentioned this idea of bringing in a student who is in charge of facilitating an experience. Let's see, talk to their teacher and Sharita could host a group of students. Okay, great. So she presented materials. Actually, I think, and she said it was very positive and empowering for her. I think that this is an important piece is to think about what kind of educational opportunities can students engage in. And actually, I was in a school in Brooklyn doing restorative practices, and what they would do is, if appropriate, out of a restorative conference, if there was the content of the conflict, if appropriate, they turned it into an educational opportunity for the students involved, become kind of a panel, and they would orient. They would go around and present to classes, or if there were visitors in the school and there was a central issue that they wanted to present to visitors that's central to who their school was, let's say related to restorative practices, they would present on that. So I think it's really powerful to kind of turn around a negative conflict situation into more of an empowerment where students do kind of psychoeducation or they learn about an issue and then they become presenters. Other folks have talked about here in the webinar today this idea of doing cross-age opportunities. So tutoring, taking leadership role with younger students. So I think that can be particularly powerful, and obviously it needs to be supervised so that it's well done, giving them an important task in the classroom. But I think overall we could still keep working as a field to think about in schools, how do we harness student voice in a way that's authentically kind of quilted across our entire school climate, where kids are having opportunities in classrooms, in staff meetings and faculty meetings, and during conflict circles, all of those, to really hear and practice having their voice heard, and also to think about how action plans coming out of restorative conferences could actually include harnessing leadership opportunities. Okay, so with that, I think I'll go back to some of the slides, Sharon. Thank you. Okay. Again, for those of you kind of just jumping in and out of this, I want to remind you I'm in the middle of talking about the core, which is this professional development program. And another piece of the module 2 that I'm jumping back into that is really critically thinking about praise. All right, so what do we know about praise? Well, we certainly know a lot from research that our behavior, when it gets positively reinforced, that behavior can increase. So think, for those of you who are a Fitbit and you reach your goal, you may in fact have rocket ships go off or something when you reach your goal and you are being reinforced. You are thinking, yes, I made my goal, I'm going to keep stepping. PBIS, or Positive Behavior Intervention Support, it relies on this notion at Tier 1, a behavioral notion that reinforcing behavior strengthens behavior. So this idea of the power of catch 'em being good, using rewards and tokens. I definitely heard some comments in there today where people are engaging in that kind of PBIS work. So from an equity perspective, however, we need to think very carefully about how these systems of praise can actually reinforce divisions and racial gaps in the school potentially, or SES gaps, gender gaps for that matter. My concern is that the same old students get the tokens, get the praise, they get to go to the field trips, and the same old students who get the reprimands, who don't get to get tokens, who don't get to go on the field trips. And actually, school districts have been bringing this up more and more. This need to really be conscious of distributing praise. So, in fact, in this module, this is one of the pieces that we touch on, that we can actually get pretty focused on negative behaviors for certain kids and actually become detectives to find them. We can unconsciously, really inadvertently, get stuck in a negative loop where we actually have increased surveillance of kids. And this is not a race-neutral phenomenon. In fact, there was a recent study of preschool teachers, in the simulation study, where they used eye-tracking software to track where preschooler teachers' eyes went in a video, and the teachers were asked to look at the video to see if they saw any precursors to negative behavior. It turned out in this study that teachers tended to watch the African-American students more, it was a racially diverse set of kids, more than the other kids. So there is, this obviously is of concern, this idea that there could be this kind of unconscious bias impacting who we put under surveillance. But there's also a lot of work to say that once you start catching negative behavior in a student, you can tend to look for it again. And so thus we have this magnifying glass here, this idea of being critically conscious of how we can overly look for negative behavior if we have a history of negative behavior with a student. And for those of you using PBIS, it's to take back to your PBIS teams to think more about issues of equity and distribution of tokens and how you're addressing making sure to kind of shake up who gets these types of tokens. Okay. So one piece in what I would just say is really heartening to me is to flip the script on this idea of of kind of overly looking for negative, and instead engaging regular use of what Mary Rowe called micro-affirmations. So she did a lot of work. Many of you have heard of this term microaggressions, right? Well, she's done a lot of work to kind of flip that term around, to think about how can we use micro-affirmations on a regular basis through the day. David Yeager also has taken this notion into what he calls wise critical feedback. It's the idea that teachers can communicate high academic standards coupled with their belief in students' potential, and that is wise critical feedback. So not only do you want to say high academic standards, but you want to couple it with a belief in the student's potential. And in an experimental study, they actually showed that when Black students were encouraged to see criticism as a reflection of their teachers' high standards and belief in their potential, their performance in core subjects improved. In other words, teachers' comments on papers indicated that they believed in them. And here's actually in their experimental work, they randomly assigned teachers to write this onto the page of the students after they were grading their essays. They said some of the teachers put this comment on there and others didn't. And in fact, the students, after the intervention occurred, there was a narrowing of the Black-white racial achievement gap by 39%. So while this seems like a very small intervention, I think it's powerful for us to extrapolate a little bit. What does this mean for racial disparities in discipline? Can we think of ways to offer wise critical feedback in our everyday norms around disciplinary practice, where we communicate a belief in the student's ability to learn and grow through a disciplinary interaction, where we communicate high standards and expectations for following the rules, understanding the agreements, but at the same time couple it with a belief in the student's potential. So while there hasn't been research on wise critical feedback related to discipline, I think it's important for us to kind of start pushing in that direction to think about what does that mean, how can we do that in everyday interaction. Okay, so in our core program, we also have a whole slew of what we call research-based practical strategies related to these types of concepts on your screen. We've also focused on the importance of bringing cognitive challenge and inspiring learning, how to do positively affirming feedback loops, and how to give sensitive feedback to students in class so that students can grow and learn and engage with you and not withdraw. That's just a little bit of a foreshadow on the core program. If you're interested, obviously, you've got the link. Feel free to check it out. Again, staff have been using it, usually Module 1 and 2, and then they may choose 3, 4, or 5. Sometimes they're integrating PLCs. But again, welcome to preview that and see what you think in terms of addressing some of the concepts in the webinar today. All right. I'm going to kind of round out the webinar by doing some reflection again on our reflection questions, and then open it up for discussion, feedback, thoughts, sharing of some of the work you're doing. We have some time to do that. And that would be on the message board. So first, let me just do a quick run-through of what we've covered today. So what I've asked is to do kind of a heady exercise in a way to think about your norm. So that's kind of somewhat of an academic term. But I think it's important for us to think about what could be getting in the way of your technical equity reform efforts. Have you put on the table some basic discussions around the purpose of discipline, for instance? Or how much do we really believe students can be held accountable through this idea of repairing harm? Or is this implicit belief that kids have to be punished, and that's the only way to go? It feels important to surface that because there will be obvious resistance and obfuscation of efforts. And then I would say, what's the norm around social-emotional learning in your building? Are staff getting opportunities for repairing harm and learning? Is it just the way we do things here in terms of everyday practices on diffusing lower-level conflict and learning through conflict? Then I asked you to think about empathic mindset. How do you kind of take a break to keep in perspective that students' behavior is contributed to through multiple factors. In other words, there's no simple kind of shaming and blaming approach to behavior. We know there are multiple contributors, things like nutrition, fatigue, skill deficits, perceived, feeling like you're the victim of racist treatment or unfair or lack of connection with adults. So there's always these different contributors that can go into dysregulated behavior. So how can we keep in mind that those complex models of contributors in our day-to-day practice, especially in the afternoons when we're more fatigued? And then we also talked about this idea of fostering positive relationships. You all are doing a lot of work, it sounds like, in a mindful way around that. And I would just keep pushing on making sure you do some checks around kids not falling through cracks, how to think about repairing when adults are stuck in a rut with certain students. And then finally, we've talked about this idea of harnessing leadership qualities of students who have multiple referrals. So I don't think that's a small thing. That's a really big shift to really embrace student voice and autonomy and agency of youth in schools. I think schools would look very different if we actually embrace that in a deep, authentic way. So, I mean, I think in sum, I'm touching a lot on different topics that are all related to issues of equity in school and how we might equitably distribute positive norms, equitably distribute positive relationships in the school, and really take a hard look at the way people can kind of jump to punitive responses, which often are on the backs of students of color. Thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to now open it up for Q&A. I guess we could do that through the typing, the whiteboard. There's Sharon or Susan, do you want to go ahead and open it up to a whiteboard screen, or I can just read the chat box? Here we have some questions.
So thank you so much. We're really excited that you were able to share the information on current research in the field, both your own research and the research of your colleagues. We're really excited that you were able to share the core program with all of us. And for those of you who can stay, we do want you to stay and have a little bit of more intimate communication with Anne, but I wanted to make sure we had the opportunity while everyone was still here to thank you for this opportunity to learn together. Susan's putting up, in addition, a feedback survey, and it's a quick survey, so we'll ask anyone who participated to go ahead and click on that link at the end and complete that so that we know how to continue to do things well and to do things better in the future.
So Julie Hall asked also about what school districts have I found some exceptional achievement gap working being done successfully. You know, I think it's hard for me sometimes to talk about districts because I think what I see is classrooms and I see schools within districts that are really working hard to address issues of equity within their building. I guess when I'm most struck, it's that they don't silo equity issues, they don't silo SEL issues, and they don't silo achievement gap and discipline gap interventions. In other words, they're thinking very holistically about the work so that they might, for instance, be engaged in critically looking at the motivating, engaging quality of their instruction, but at the same time they're thinking about deeply about their behavioral supports for kids who are in greater need, and they're thinking about trying to shift the school towards a problem-solving approach. So in other words, initiatives are more synthetic. They're kind of weaved together, and I get concerned when classroom management, for example, interventions or shifts are done without looking at instruction. So it's that, again, this kind of fragmented approach to school change.
Laura has a question, and I'll answer this. This is Susan. The webinar will be archived. It'll take a little while for us to get our captioning up on it, So in the meantime, if you're interested in viewing it or sharing it with somebody who does not need the captioning, you can let me know, and I can send you the link to that. So let me go ahead and put my email address in the chat so that you'll have that.
I think you've seen on the chat box there's a handout where it has the citations, it has the link to CORE. If you want that as well, there's a link there to Dropbox, a handout that we put together.
And the PowerPoints are there in there's 2 up in a PDF, so you can also access those there. And I just put that in the chat as well. I know that Swinder has been typing, so I'm hoping that she'll have something that she has would like to ask or share. Oh, there we go. It says, I appreciate the focus on the implicit norms and beliefs around discipline and the importance of micro-affirmations and wise critical feedback.
Yeah, thank you for that. I feel like we have more to go on these kind of more micro interactions and daily work around discipline. And what does it look like to do wise critical feedback around behavior? And also maybe in terms of parent-teacher meetings and, displaying and modeling some of that with parents. I mean, I just think there's a lot more for us to push on how these kind of micro interactions, whether they're negative, more from a micro, aggression point of view or micro affirmation point of view, that we can kind of model and learn from one another in that everyday practice. So thanks for your comment.
I think that is all for today. We've put the survey link back in, and want to thank Ann once again for rocking with the challenges we had technically, but also mostly for the wonderful content that you've shared today. And if folks have any other questions, feel free to send them to us, and if there's something that we need to get to Ann for her to answer, we will share that as well. And actually, I'm going to move the chat back down so you can see Ann's contact information. Just one moment. And there it is.
Thanks.
Thanks so much,
yeah,
Ann.
thank you so much for your attention today, and especially to Sharon and Susan and Connie. It's been great work putting this together. So thanks for everyone's attention, and I hope everyone has a nice afternoon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.